Welcome everybody to our update today, covering an employer's obligations through the changing alert levels. For those who don't know me, I'm Kirsty McDonald, one of the Employment and Health and Safety Partners at Duncan Cotterill. I'm joined today by Jessie Lapthorne, Mark Lawlor and Alastair Espie. And we're going to take you through those key considerations as we move through the alert levels. What we'll do is we will record today's presentation and send that out to you as well. And the plan is to take questions at the end of the session. You each have an ability on your screen to send through some questions, so please do so, and we will cover off as many as we can at the end of the session. The presenters apologise in advance for any inadvertent children noises in the background. We're hoping to have those under control, but if you do hear them, we do apologise. Before I hand over to the other presenters today, what I'd like to do is to recap on the key legal obligations, which of course are more critical now than ever. And those obligations stem from the Employment Relations Act, the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Holidays Act, and of course, a business's employment agreements and policies. There is, of course, additional considerations such as privacy considerations, which are not listed on the slide. But if we turn first to the Employment Relations Act and the obligation of good faith, you'll all be aware of this obligation of good faith and the fact that it underpins the entire employment relationship. And that's the duty to be active and constructive in maintaining the employment relationship. Now more than ever, it's important, of course, to be alive to the fact that employees are aware that things are changing in the business, that there's pressure on the business at this time, and that decisions might need to be made. But it is important to be communicative with your employees, to provide relevant information, and to consider any feedback they may have before making decisions, bearing in mind that any decision at this time may well have an adverse effect on their ongoing employment. So it's just being mindful of this obligation at the outset and then continuing with reacting to how your business is going to manage through the changing alert levels. We leap forward and consider potentially that you as a business may need to make some changes and may well end up making some of your employees redundant during this time. Then it is important to consider the Section 103A test for justification. Because if in 3, 4, 5 months' time you have a personal grievance for unjustified dismissal, the test is going to be whether your actions and the decisions you made were one that a fair and reasonable employer could make or could have done in all the circumstances. And of course, these circumstances are unprecedented. They are very different to the circumstances we are usually dealing with. So it's going to be important to keep this in your back of your minds when making decisions for the business that may impact your employees. Turning to the Health and Safety at Work Act, this of course overlaps with the Employment Relations Act, where there is an obligation to provide a safe workplace. Under the Health and Safety at Work Act, of course, a PCBU or a person conducting a business or undertaking must ensure, so far as reasonably practicable, the health and safety of its workers. And for some of those obligations are quite obvious. It's about providing appropriate PPE gear. It's about taking steps to ensure the social distancing that's appropriate. For others working from home, it's about ensuring that employees have turned their minds to what are the risks that may be in existence in their home working environment, and what are some appropriate controls for such risks. For others, it may be that you're an essential service, and how do you manage your vulnerable employees and workers? So there are a number of considerations under the Health and Safety at Work Act to work through. And one of those, of course, is that an employee does have an ability to refuse to work if they have reasonable grounds to believe that reporting for work may expose them to serious harm. Now, that's important to consider in the COVID-19 framework, and it may be even more important to consider as businesses look to reopen under Alert Level 3. And we're going to cover this in more detail throughout the presentation as to how you manage employees' reluctance to come to work or concerns they have in regards to their own safety if they're required to come to work. So those are some of the key legal considerations to keep in mind when working through these next changes in the alert levels and your obligations to your employees. I'm very shortly going to hand over to Alastair Espie, a Senior Associate in our team, who's going to take you through some of the practical considerations, whether or not your business is reopening. Are employees entitled to be paid? What does reopening mean in terms of the wage subsidy? What do you do if you don't have enough work for all of your employees? And what happens to some of those temporary arrangements that you've agreed during lockdown? So I'll hand you over now to Alastair Espie.
Right, thank you, Kirsty, and good morning, everyone. It's great to virtually be here to talk about this, I guess, as we've heard Kirsty say, and the word you hear a lot, unprecedented situation. And I think going forward, particularly as we move from level 4 into level 3, that's only going to become more the case and certainly a lot murkier in a number of respects. So what I'm going to talk through for my section today are around, I guess, in light of the government's recent announcements about what moving from alert level 4 to alert level 3 could look like, what that will mean for you and your business. And then also the key, I guess, critical issue that we've been working through the lockdown leading up to it, and certainly will continue to work through going forward, the issue of whether staff are entitled to be paid and how those arrangements will work. So I guess today is D-Day in a number of respects. We're going to find out at 4 o'clock whether we are moving to alert level 3 later this week or potentially at some later point in time, and no doubt you'll all be glued to the TV when that happens. But in the meanwhile, the government has been very clear around exactly, or at least what alert level 3 should look like from a business operations standpoint. And there's fairly detailed guidance on the government's COVID-19 website around the various elements of level 3 and how that will work. But I think for our purposes, some of the key things that we've really focused on and would like to flag are around what it means for particularly those businesses that are currently shut down during the lockdown and who may be then allowed to transition to some sort of physical operation at a level 3 stage and you know, to expand out as we go down to level 2. So the key, I guess, change is that currently only essential businesses are allowed to physically operate. Non-essential businesses are required to either operate from home or to close entirely. And I think by now you should all know whether you are in that essential or non-essential category. In terms of level 3, though, we'll be moving to a broader concept of who can operate, and that will be a focus on safe operations, and I'll come back to what that means in a little while. Schools will be allowed to reopen on a limited basis, and the government has sort of slightly changed the position since the initial alert level 3 announcement. So you may have heard them use the term that schools may reopen on a voluntary basis. Now they've clarified that schools will reopen to year 10, which is the same as before, but it's only for children to attend school where their parents or their caregivers actually need them to do so. So it remains the case that if children can remain at home and learn by distance, they still should. So it should only be a limited return. In terms of working in operations, well, as I said before, only safe operations will be allowed to physically resume. In all other cases where an employee can return or can work from home, then the expectation is that they very much still will. So it's only where an employee cannot perform from work that an employer can start considering returning them back into the workplace in a physical capacity. Lastly, travel is still very much restricted. Yes, there is a greater easing or greater scope for what people can and cannot do. Certainly there will be some scope for bubbles to expand, but for the most part, everyone will still need to remain at home to the greatest extent possible. So moving to level 2, now updated guidance has been provided around this, but I think the key thing to understand is level 3, which we're moving to, is different in a lot of respects from the level 3 we were in pre-lockdown. So while this is an indication of what level 2 may look like in the future, it may well still change further. So for the most part, we expect to see public venues opening in almost all cases at that point. Obviously, safety measures will still need to be complied with. Workplaces will have far greater freedom to operate. Last time in level 2, there was still an encouragement for people to work from home where possible, and it may well be that that is the case going forward, but it may not be mandatory like at level 3. There will be, in all likelihood, greater ability to travel from location to location, and certainly the recreational activities will expand further beyond what we've already seen at level 3. So in terms of the safe operations concepts that we now have at level 3, that's probably going to be the critical idea for those businesses that are in that non-essential and currently effectively shut down category. So as I've mentioned before, people who can work from home still should. So if you are a business where your entire workforce can work from home at level 3, then they will need to continue doing so. Where businesses can reopen in a safe way, they'll need to be able to demonstrate as part of that their operations are contactless, so customers won't be entering stores, there won't be face-to-face and sustained contact, and that's something that's really going to affect retail, it's going to affect hospitality and service-related industries, hairdressing and so forth. So in some of those cases, there may be abilities to open on a limited and I suppose partial basis, particularly where, say, delivery or online orderings or online sales are an option. But if your business relies entirely on face-to-face contact with customers, and hairdressing is an obvious example, then reopening is not going to be possible at level 3. But where a business can reopen, then they're also going to need to maintain a very comprehensive contact tracing system. We've heard a lot in the media around contact tracing and the need for that to ramp up, and certainly there is a lot of work I think the Ministry of Health is having to do around improving that system. But a big part of returning to level 3 will be businesses making sure they can track who is coming into the workplace, who is there at any given time, and who people are coming into contact with, because in the event there is a COVID-19 case that emerges in a workplace, and there will be a desire for very quick and comprehensive information around who that individual may have been in contact with. Otherwise, social distancing will be a big part of workplaces reopening. Currently, essential businesses need to maintain a 2-metre distance between staff. Moving to level 3, in the workplace that will only be 1 metre. Outside, in a more general circumstances, it will still be 2 metres for anyone else. But they accept that there will be, I guess, a narrower scope of people there and greater ability to control who's coming into contact with one another. So the government has slightly relaxed that, which means that a lot of businesses may be able to open where, say, the 2-metre distance was just too much, for at least for their entire workforce. And obviously, there will be a heightened hygiene and cleaning regime that's expected, and that really all, besides just being a level 3 requirement, would in any event tie into those health and safety obligations and considerations that Kirsty talked through earlier. So that table there effectively just summarises what I've said, and as you can see at level 4, the situation is relatively clean. Essential businesses open, everyone else is closed, and then in level 3, we come into this concept of essential businesses still being open, and then other educational and non-essential businesses opening in different sort of ways. So very much at level 3, it will require a case-by-case assessment. It's not going to be a binary open or closed. It will be a matter of, okay, can we open in a safe way? And can we bring staff who can't work from home back to work? And if so, to what extent can we have them working? What operations are feasible? What aren't? What require us to interact with customers, and what can be done without that? So it will require businesses to look very closely at how they work, how they operate, what their business model is, and what is going to be possible before they can then make a decision about reopening at level 3. So turning to pay, and I guess it's fair to say that from Mark, Jessie, Kirsty, and my perspectives, a lot of our work through the lockdown has been questions around pay, and a big part of that has obviously been the wage subsidy, which Jessie's going to talk to, and the impact that's had. But there has been a lot of questions around, well, as a starting point, are employees entitled to be paid during the lockdown? And the question going forward will be, are they entitled to be paid at level 3 if, say, we can't open to any or only to a limited extent? Now, I guess, again, it's fair to say, and and to use that word, unprecedented, this situation really has thrown up a number of unprecedented scenarios that really the law hasn't had to contemplate before. So there has been an element of trying to sort of figure out, all right, well, you know, when this goes to court, or if it goes to court, hopefully not, how would that be determined? And from our perspective, the key principles have been, first of all, is an employee working? If they are, then yes, they're entitled to be paid as per normal, and then anything that's a departure from that will require an agreed variation. The second part, though, is if an employee is not working, we then look at, are they ready, willing and able to work? And I guess to explain that concept, that sort of comes out of the common law idea that an employment relationship is a bargain between an employer and an employee. The employer will provide the employee with work and remuneration for undertaking that work, and the employee will remain available to carry it out. So the key question is always going to be, if an employer can't provide work, is the employee ready, willing and able to work? And if the answer to that question is yes, then they're still going to be entitled to be paid because they're in a position to meet their bargain, and then it's going to be a matter of, is there a variation that needs to be agreed or some other alternative arrangement that can be put in place, leave, or just the wage subsidy, things like that. So we work through a number of scenarios, and I guess even though we're coming out of lockdown, it's probably helpful to understand really where we're coming from or where we're currently at, so we can look at where we're going to go. So there's obviously, many of my clients on the call will know that there are many variations to these scenarios that we've had to grapple with, and really it has not been a case of one size fits all. But at a high level, there's really been three broad scenarios we've seen. The first is an employer is an essential business. They can work and operate during the lockdown, obviously subject to safety considerations, and employees are therefore able to work from the premises. And in those circumstances, it's fairly straightforward. An employee is entitled to 100% of pay. The second scenario, again, relatively straightforward, is a non-essential business, so can't operate, but employers are able to work from home. And again, starting point there will be that employees are entitled to 100% pay. And I guess it's important to appreciate that that starting point is the case, even if there is only limited work for those employees, or the employer may not want the employees to continue working, in which case it's going to be a matter of varying the arrangement by agreement or looking at alternatives such as leave and so forth. The third scenario, which is the one that has led to a lot of lawyers debating it, but I think where the consensus has landed, and certainly where our view lands, is that if you're a non-essential business and you have employees who can't work from home, so let's talk about roles that are, say, physical, require the employee to be on site, construction, factories, those sort of things, and they can't do their work from home, then the starting point there, in our view at least, is that the employee is not really willing and able to work. Yes, the employer can't provide work, but the employee at the same time, they're required to be at home. They can't come out and perform that role. And that's where the starting point is. They're not entitled to be paid, but then as an employer, you need to look at alternatives such as the wage subsidy, leave, and so forth. So that's broadly what it's been at level 4. Moving to level 3, and I guess it's fair to say that because there is such a, I guess, a case-by-case assessment required for whether a business can operate or not, and to the degree to which it can, things become a bit murkier. So the essential business scenario is the same. An employee is entitled to 100% of their pay, but non-essential businesses, we've now got those who can operate safely and who will be able to return to some extent. If an employee can work from home, they still will, but if they can't, then they can come into the workplace. And in those scenarios, we're looking at 100% pay. Scenario 3, we're looking at non-essential businesses who can't operate safely, but they may still have employees that can work from home. So that's really where all businesses that are non-essential at the moment are currently at, and where they have staff who can work from home. Again, the employee is entitled to 100% pay. It's just going to be a matter of how much work do they have to do, and if there isn't enough, then you're going to need to look at negotiating some sort of arrangement with those employees or putting something else in place. And then the fourth scenario, which we may see coming up quite a lot going forward, is a non-essential business can't operate safely and the employee is not in a position to work from home. So that's really the same scenario in a lot of ways for a lot of businesses currently. But again, coming back to that very, I guess, case-specific assessment that this will involve, you will have a lot of businesses who are not able to operate safely, or can only operate safely to a very limited degree, which won't allow all employees to come back. And I guess the murkiness around this is this still a case where the employee is not really willing and able to work, or is it really a case that the employer is somewhat constrained by its own operations and therefore can't provide the work? Look, there's arguments both ways. There's certainly an argument that those employees still aren't really willing and able because they can't safely return, and that they're not entitled to 100% pay. But because this isn't quite as binary as that lockdown scenario now, it's very much dependent on the employer and their circumstances. We think that the chance that an employee is going to be found to be entitled to their pay here is a lot higher. And certainly we think that's where that's likely to fall if this issue ends up in a court down the line. So again, going back to Kirsty's principles before that she's talked through, this is one where good faith will be particularly key. And yes, you can certainly take the approach of proposing the way forward and seeing what the employers say. But in these circumstances where, one, it's unprecedented, and two, we are into really, really grey territory now, consultation with staff will be key. And if you can reach agreement with them about working arrangements going forward, that's certainly going to be preferable to having an arrangement which employees could then come back and try and challenge down the line. So going out early to staff, if you haven't already done so, and setting out what things are likely to look at, like when we go back to level 3, and I think after today's announcement, that will be something that needs to happen quite quickly. And regardless of the approach you're wanting to take, giving staff certainty around what level 3 will look like for them, because naturally people will want to understand, okay, we're moving out of lockdown, can we return to work? Will I be paid on full? Will I have to take more leave? Will I still be on the wage subsidy? How's that going to work? So good faith, being clear in your communications, making sure staff understand where they sit will be an essential part of transitioning from this lockdown into level 3. So that ends my bit. And as I mentioned before, the wage subsidy has been a lot of our, an issue we've been having to focus on a lot, and it will certainly have an impact on all those scenarios I've talked through. So I'm going to hand over to Jessie now, who's going to take it from here.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to reiterate Kirsty's point at the beginning that my household is one of those which is impacted by small people. They're currently not here, so hopefully I will have managed that for the meantime, but apologies if that changes. So thanks for that, Al. And just picking up where Al left off, talking about the wage subsidy, one of the questions that we're seeing from people is, what impact does the change in alert level have on the wage subsidy? And I think one of the key factors to remember here is that the wage subsidy is actually not an agreement between employers and the employee. What it is an agreement that's been entered into with the government, and so the obligations that apply are those that applied at the time that you entered into the arrangement with the government. What we do see with the wage subsidy is that it brings in at that level of complexity to the decisions that employers are making throughout the course of these unprecedented times. And so it is a circumstance, going back to the points that Kirsty discussed at the outset, that weighs into that test for justification and the decision-making processes that employers are going through. So the relevance to that is that it could apply to claims for unjustified disadvantage and unjustified dismissal, and some of the decisions which could weigh into those claims are things like what you're paying your workers and whether or not you can retain them. So that's where the wage subsidy adds that level of complexity, but it doesn't change those obligations that applied at the base level. And so those obligations in terms of retention of staff could be slightly different depending on when you applied for the subsidy. So if you applied under the original scheme before 4 p.m. on the 27th of March, then the expectation is that you'll use best endeavours to retain your staff for the full 12-week period. And if you applied after that cut-off point to the revised scheme, then the expectation is that you will retain your staff for the full duration of that 12-week period. And Mark's going to talk a little bit about how the wage subsidy affects your ability to restructure when we get on to Mark's piece a bit later. In terms of that obligation to pay, again, those obligations are unaffected. So employers must pass on the full amount of the subsidy unless the person earned less than the subsidy amount. And there is still that obligation to use best efforts to top up the subsidy to 80%. And one point that there is a bit of common misconception around is that 80% point and what that means in terms of reductions in pay. I think there has been some assumption by some employers around the traps that because the wage subsidy talks about paying at 80%, that means that anyone receiving the subsidy can just be dropped down to 80%, which obviously isn't the case. And Al's already taken us through all of those different scenarios and what level of pay people are entitled to at base rate, subject to any variations that have been put in place. So it's certainly not the case that you can, upon receiving the subsidy, just drop people down to 80%. Where it has come into play is if you had people under level 4 sitting in that category of not being ready, willing and able to work, then the expectation was that they weren't necessarily able to receive any pay, so they were entitled to receive the subsidy, and if you could, you needed to top that up to 80%. So there is a possibility coming out of level 4 that you may have people who are sitting in that category of previously not being ready, willing and able to work because they couldn't attend the workplace, or they were mandated to stay home, where they are receiving 80% of their pay but haven't necessarily agreed to that reduction in salary from 100% to 80%, because at that point there wasn't any requirement that you did agree that with them. So if you have people sitting in that category where there isn't an agreed variation, then as Al said before, you're getting into that murky category of coming out of level 4 into level 3, where you may need to agree with them that reduction from 100%, because the safe option is to treat them as being entitled to 100% of their normal wages at the point that we move out of level 4. And even though you have been paying them 80% because they weren't ready, willing and able to work at level 4, you're going to need to put in place a variation to drop them down to 80% post level 4. And then in the event, just on the bottom of that slide, if coming out of lockdown you're unable to top up wages to 100% or even to 80%, then there are some alternative options that you can be looking at there. And I'm going to talk about all of those in a bit more detail, except for the bottom one, which Mark will come on to talk about shortly. So another question that we've been facing, just moving the slides along, is what if an employee refuses to return to the workplace? Sorry, I'll just wait for the slides to catch up with me. And this is something that we've already been dealing with in terms of the current essential services regime, because we do have obviously a number of clients who have had that issue arise while they've been operational in level 4. But it is actually a very real consideration that it's possible coming out of level 4 into level 3, there'll be a lot of reluctance for people to go back to the way that things were. The government's done an excellent job of making us all think that we all have to stay home, and that's assessed on the basis that, you know, New Zealand has largely complied with the obligation to stay home. So there are a lot of people that may be concerned about their well-being or the well-being of those around them, and are maybe reluctant to go back to working. The position in terms of assessing what to do if somebody's not willing to come to work is to ask why. Why is it that they're unable or unwilling to attend the workplace? Obviously, sick leave provisions still apply as per the Holidays Act. So an employee is entitled to sick leave if they are sick or injured, or their spouse or partner is sick or injured, or someone who depends on them for care is sick or injured. And that is an important distinction to make, because we may have a bunch of parents who could be within your workforce who don't want to send their children back to school, for fear of risk of COVID-19 being contracted, and so they may be seeking to rely on sort of those dependent care arrangements to use sick leave. That wouldn't apply unless the person is sick or injured. But having said that, there is a discretion that an employer could grant access to those arrangements or other leave arrangements to allow somebody to not return to the workplace and perhaps to use sick leave entitlements. But if you were doing that, a word of caution to show that there's been compliance with any Holidays Act audits that may be undertaken in due course, you would want to have the individual actually requesting to use that leave for that purpose, and a clear agreement that that would be the case. This is a bit of a busy slide, so I'll take my time on it. So another potential entitlement that's available is the Essential Workers Leave Payment Scheme. Now, I expect that we will see this scheme renamed to something similar to what it was prior to the Level 4 lockdown, which was, if you recall, it was called the COVID-19 Leave Scheme. And this is available to a range of different scenarios. At the moment, this scheme only applies to those workers in essential services, but as I say, I think we will see that widened. There is an aspect of the eligibility criteria which requires businesses to either meet the 30% decline in revenue test, which is the same as the wage subsidy revenue test, or to be able to show that there has been an ability or negative impact on the ability to support workers over this period. And that's quite a low threshold under this current scheme. For example, you would meet that threshold if you had a worker who you wanted to continue to pay who couldn't come to work for one of the scenarios listed, and you were paying somebody else to cover that person's workload while they're off. That would be a negative impact, so the threshold would be met. And the obligation, similar to the wage subsidy scheme, is that you have to use best efforts to top up the pay to 80%. The pay entitlement is the same as under the wage subsidy, so $585 for full-time workers and $350 for part-time workers. But the difference is that it only applies for a 4-week period as opposed to the 12-week period that's applicable to the wage subsidy. Although you can apply for it more than once, you can apply as soon as you get to the 3-week period of that 4-week period. So when it applies to workers who are in self-isolation because they have contracted COVID-19, or workers who are in self-isolation because they have been in close contact with a person who has COVID-19, or workers with dependents who are either sick from COVID-19 or are self-isolating due to close contact. Those are all scenarios where the person is required, in line with Ministry of Health guidelines, to stay at home. The last of those on the slide is where workers either have a serious health condition which puts them at high risk, or a member of their household has a serious health condition which puts them at high risk. And this is not a requirement that they stay at home. The entitlement under this category is where the person has told you that they have that serious health condition and where you have agreed that they will not work for an agreed period. So in this case, while the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Social Development will not ask for proof when you're applying for this entitlement, you may want to ask for proof if there's a reason that you don't believe or have reason to suspect that the person may not actually have that serious health condition. And bearing in mind that at level 3, we are only operating if we have put in place all of the measures that make the workplace safe, the Ministry of Health has said that people can return to work in that arrangement. So there may be a need to provide a copy of that of those arrangements that you have put in place to the person's medical advisor and see whether or not they agree that actually it is necessary for that person to remain away. But it's something that you'd need to look into and understand from the individual the circumstances arising in their case, and make sure that you are obviously engaging with that person in line with the duty of good faith. And perhaps take some legal advice on that point if you are concerned. that the person may not be acting truthfully. And then in terms of employees who are not eligible for the Essential Workers Leave Payment Scheme, this is something that could also arise. So there are a number of, I guess, key employment law principles that kick in at this point. So you have the base position is that employees must follow a reasonable direction of their employer, but on the flip side, you have the employee rights that somebody has a right to refuse to carry out work if they consider on reasonable grounds that it will expose them to serious harm. So both of those tests, or both of those obligations, import an element of reasonableness, and it will require some investigation into the reasons for why that person says that they don't believe it's safe for them to carry out their role, and why on the flip side the employer says that it is reasonable for them to direct that person to come to work. As well as that, as Kirsty mentioned earlier, employers obviously have that duty to ensure the workplace is safe, and that test requires them to take all steps as are reasonably practicable to ensure that's the case. So again, you'll need to consider the person's personal circumstances and discuss those risk mitigation strategies that have been put in place. Obviously, again, at level 3, we're dealing with safe operations, so you'll need to understand why that person believes that those operations or those measures that have been put in place to mitigate that risk are insufficient. And then if you do reach the view that it is okay for that person to remain away, then you'll need to be looking at what alternative solutions there could be for that person. Again, that puts that person in a category of not being ready, willing and able to work, because that person is not able to work because of their own personal circumstances. So you will need to be looking at whether or not you've got the wage subsidy, because obviously the wage subsidy brings with it those obligations to top up to 80% if you can, and failing that, looking at options for that person to take leave, and whether or not there's any other alternative arrangements you could put in place. Is there a different job that they could do for that period from home, which would enable them to guard against the risks that they've identified? And failing all of that, there's obviously the discretion of the employer to continue to pay should you choose to do so. What if there isn't enough work for employees to do? Again, a very common question we've been receiving during the period of the level 4 lockdown. Many businesses obviously have been negatively affected, and it's not as simple as just turning on a tap coming out of level 4 that suddenly things will be back up and running again. So what are the options for what you can do? The most common approach we have been seeing is to try and negotiate a reduction in hours and or remuneration. And I say and or because they aren't necessarily obligations that go hand in hand. The reduction in remuneration can come whilst still expecting people to continue on at 100% of their work. So whereas the reduction in hours may bring with it a commensurate reduction in remuneration, and there's slightly different processes that you would undertake, but the starting point being that you must reach agreement or must attempt to reach agreement, and certainly around reduction of remuneration only, you would need to have that agreed as a variation to the person's employment agreement. An alternative is to try and seek agreement that the employee will use some of their leave entitlements, and there's been quite a lot of controversy around this particular piece. We've seen some employers simply directing that people take leave without seeking to agree first, and the unions have obviously made quite a lot of that. It is still the case, and has always been the case, that employers can direct that employees use accrued leave entitlements, but the Holidays Act requires that before you do that, you seek agreement with the individual about taking their leave. So try to agree in the first instance, and if that's not possible, it is possible to direct that they take their leave entitlements, but they must be given 14 days notice of that requirement. And then if those if those arrangements aren't sufficient, and then also depending on the length of the downturn or the predicted downturn, then restructuring may need to be considered, and I'll leave that for Mark to come on and talk about shortly. So if a business is staying closed after the lockdown, so that is where obviously it's not safe for them to operate and reopen, or it may be that it's only a partial reopening. I think the key point to note is that employees will still be entitled to be paid unless otherwise agreed, and that's that grey area that Alastair mentioned before. So our view is that we think that it's safest in these circumstances that employees are still paid as normal, because it's really coming down to the employer not being able to open after the lockdown, while those individuals are actually able to come to work and have been sort of cleared to come out of lockdown. So again, those same options to mitigate that situation apply in terms of looking at agreed variations or alternative leave arrangements, and potential restructuring if those measures wouldn't be sufficient. And just before I hand over to Mark to touch on the restructuring piece, there's just one further point to touch on, which is what do you do about employees on varied contracts or other alternative arrangements which you may have put in place during the level 4 lockdown. So in this case, I think the starting point would be to look at what exactly you have agreed with them, and it may have been done under urgency and it may have been done in some haste, and certainly these are unprecedented times, and you can be forgiven for perhaps not thinking forward to the next step. But have you agreed that it will automatically lapse? So you may have agreed a reduction in salary that will automatically revert to 100% at the end of the lockdown, or even on the 23rd of April, if that was the expected date that the lockdown would end. Or have you agreed that you've got a discretion to continue that in the circumstances where the finances don't permit a return to 100%? So look at what it is that you've actually put in place, and if you have got a fixed date or fixed end date for that variation, then there may be a requirement, or there is a requirement, sorry, to reach a further agreement unless you want those arrangements to revert back to the previous position. And just the one final point to touch on, if there have been agreements reached around the use of leave, once those agreements are put in place, they can't be unilaterally revoked by either side. So if you've agreed that the employee will take leave, even whether they requested it or whether they were directed to use leave, then it has to be mutually agreed to come out of those arrangements. It's just a finer point of the Holidays Act. That's my piece finalised. I'll just pass over to Mark to discuss restructuring.
Thanks, Jessie. Good morning, everyone, and thanks again for taking the time to join us. We hope that you're finding this content helpful. I'm going to touch on the issue of redundancy. And the question we're getting a lot is, in terms of redundancy and restructuring, is if I have applied for the wage subsidy for my staff, can I still use redundancy as a potential tool if the situation worsens, or if I feel as though I'm left with no alternative but to reduce the number of positions that I've got? And if so, when could I commence looking at that as an option, and to what extent am I hamstrung by the money that I'm receiving by way of the subsidy? So there's really just three sort of points I wanted to get across this morning. The first is that the tool of redundancy remains a tool that you have at your disposal. The fact that you've applied for a subsidy doesn't prevent you from considering redundancies if the business considers that it can no longer sustain the particular positions that you have. So that's the first point. The second point is if you're considering restructuring, you still have to follow the standard process around restructure, including formulating a business case and then running through a consultation exercise with your staff. And really the third message that I wanted to get across is, notwithstanding the fact that redundancy remains a tool in the toolkit, there will need to be some care around the treatment of the subsidy if you get to the point of deciding that a role is going to be made redundant. So I'm going to cover those points off as we go through this. The first point to note around the impact of the subsidy on redundancy is that there's a slight subtlety in terms of when you apply for the subsidy. So as that slide shows, if you applied for the subsidy before the 27th of March, then you've got to use your best efforts to keep those staff employed for the period of the 12 weeks of the wage subsidy. If you can show that you've used your best efforts to keep employees retained for that period, but you're not able to, then yes, you can move to implement a restructure. So in this first category, the short answer is yes, you could make redundancies within the 12-week period, so long as you follow a fair process and you prepare a business case and you consult in the ordinary way. There's no clear guidance really as to what best efforts means. What we think it means is quite simply that you have to use your best endeavours to look at alternatives to redundancy before you decide to restructure. So for instance, that might be looking at getting staff to agree to take a reduction in pay or a reduction in hours. We don't think that the onus is particularly high, but we think that if, in terms of proceeding with a restructure, you'd need to show that you did look at those alternatives and use best endeavours to see if they could work in your particular situation. If you apply for the subsidy after the 27th of March, the government has raised the bar somewhat in terms of the obligation to keep staff connected to the business for those 12 weeks. So gone is the qualifier around best efforts. There's an obligation to keep those staff employed for the period of the wage subsidy. And as I say, the best efforts qualification is removed. So our view is that that's still not a complete bar on the ability to consider a restructure within those 12 weeks. We think that it would still be permissible to begin a restructure process in that 12-week window, so long as any decisions that were made to terminate employment didn't occur until the expiry of that 12-week period. And I'll come on in a moment just to talk about how you deal with the wage subsidy and any excess payments, if you like, as part of that. So just dealing with the standard, if you like, restructuring process, and I'll come on in a moment just to the implications that COVID places on this approach. But the starting point with any restructure, whether it's within COVID or beyond, is the formulation of a proposal to restructure. There's a couple of really key fundamentals with restructuring. One is the commencement of the process and the communication to staff about the business case, and then the second critical aspect is the consultation itself. In terms of formulating a proposal for change, the employer is always having to tread that fine line between formulating a plan without actually making a decision about the matter. The idea is that you're able to have a firm working plan as to what you want to do, but then you have to consult with staff about that and give them an opportunity to comment and an opportunity to sort of influence your ultimate decision. So in terms of that very first step, it's now clear that you have to provide enough information so that the employee can understand the business case and can meaningfully respond. So there is an obligation to provide all of the relevant information you have regarding your business case so that employees can respond and take advice. In terms of the consultation itself, the obligation is you have to keep an open mind and be prepared to change your plan if the situation dictates. you have to tell the employee that they can get legal representation and they can be represented through that process. They can also have a support person present. I'll talk in a moment just about the logistics of how you actually consult with someone in the current climate, because obviously face-to-face meetings are not something that can be utilised. Once you've gone through the consultation process, it's then a matter of reaching a decision on whether or not you're going to implement the proposal or not. At that stage, there is a duty to consider whether there may well be alternatives to a proposal to disestablish a position. And again, in the current context, that comes back to considering whether there might be an alternative to disestablishing the role, for instance, reaching an agreement with the employee to reduce their hours or their pay, or to take a period of leave. But fundamentally, if you've consulted, you've considered the employee's views, and you don't believe that there are practical alternatives to disestablishing a role, then you can proceed to make that decision. The next step really is if it depends on whether the Kirsty, just take me back to that previous slide just for a moment. I just want to touch on selection. There may well be a situation where you have a number of roles and you are proposing to reduce the number of roles from whatever that number is to a lesser number. And so effectively you're making a selection of from the pool of employees who are undertaking that role. If you're looking at a scenario like that, you've got to provide employees with the selection criteria that you're going to use, and then discuss with them their provisional scores against that selection criteria and give them an opportunity to comment on their individual scores. And then based on that, and having considered an employee's feedback around their provisional scores, you can then proceed to make some decisions on selection. In terms of notice, you've got to provide the notice, the least of the notice that's in their individual employment agreement. There's no statutory obligation to provide redundancy compensation unless you've got a particular term to that effect in your employment agreement, or you've got a current redundancy policy that provides for a redundancy compensation formula. So just moving on to the COVID sort of specific implications. I'm just conscious of time because we want to allow some time for questions at the end, but just running through how that process looks in the current landscape. In terms of the formulating the business case, obviously in the current environment, business reasons can include significant downturn in sales or revenue due to COVID or the loss of customers or suppliers. And as I say again, one of the keys here is writing a good business case and providing that in your initial letter to the employee, which explains the realities facing the business at this time. In terms of the second phase, the consultation, as I say, obviously it's not going to be really feasible at the moment to have face-to-face meetings, and so what we're advising clients to do is to use the various platforms, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, whatever the platform is, to hold those meetings virtually. They can still be perfectly effective and we think within the obligation to consult. As I say, the obligation is to provide that employee an opportunity of feedback and then to consider that feedback, and using a virtual platform to do that we think is perfectly fine. And then, as I say, in terms of before proceeding to make a decision, you've got to consider what alternatives there might be to making a decision to disestablish a role. And so again, that's a matter of being able to show that you've considered other alternatives, for instance, a drop in pay or hours, but being able to demonstrate that your view is that, notwithstanding those possibilities, the company's view is that it can no longer sustain the particular role or roles. So just moving on to the situation, and as I say, the third point I wanted to cover off is the treatment of the wage subsidy where a decision is made to implement redundancies within the 12-week window. If it's a situation where you've applied for the subsidy beyond the 27th of March, as I say, there is an obligation in terms of the declaration you've given to accept the subsidy to keep those staff employed through to the end of that 12-week period. But our view is that it's still possible and a business is able to commence the redundancy process during that 12-week window, so long as any decision's not made until the expiry of those 12 weeks. And our recommendation around that is that you can certainly use the subsidy to pay the employee's wages and salary through to the expiry of their contractual notice period. And our recommendation is that it's permissible to use any excess in that subsidy by providing an extended period of notice through to the end of 12 weeks. So you would effectively provide an extended notice and continue to provide at least the wage subsidy through to the end of that term. In terms of if you applied for the subsidy prior to the 27th of March, as I say, it is possible to terminate employment within that window, but it does raise the issue of how to treat the excess subsidy, and there's no clear guidance on that. What we're recommending to our clients at the moment is that prior to making a decision around how to treat that subsidy, is to inquire of MSD as to whether they want the excess subsidy returned to them or whether they're comfortable with paying that subsidy or the excess subsidy to the employees concerned. We've seen anecdotal sort of reports that MSD has been happy for the employer to provide that subsidy to the employee directly, but we're recommending that just a bit of care is taken at that point. So that's really the points I wanted to cover. So just those 3 points to bear in mind. One, redundancy does remain a tool in the toolkit to be used. Two, still have to prepare a business case and run through the consultation process required. And three, just some care needs to be sort of taken in terms of dealing with any excess in the subsidy. So Kirsty, I'll throw back to you and any questions, but that's what I wanted to cover off. I'll throw back to you.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Jessie and Alastair. We have got some time for questions, and I think it would be really useful to work through some of these. The first is one for you, Alastair. It'd be interesting to get your views on this. What do you consider the threshold is for working from home?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one, and one we've had come up in the past. Again, this is going to be one of those cases where there isn't necessarily a clear answer, and it is very much going to be a fact-specific analysis of a particular employee and their role and what they do. In some cases, it will be clear-cut. If an employee is working in, say, construction, for example, and their works in production in a factory, it's going to be relatively clear-cut. But there may be other cases where perhaps they could perform a small part of their role, some sort of preparatory work or something like that from home. The way I would look at it would be to simply say, well, in normal circumstances outside of this lockdown, could the employee perform some of their role from home? And I don't mean, are they actually performing it? I mean, could they? So we're really looking at capability. Is there work they can do from home? And even if that means a bit of a reshuffling of some of their responsibilities, if they're open to it, I would certainly encourage employers to explore that. It's only really going to be where it's in that clear category of it is a fully manual role or role that can only be performed physically on site, that it'll be really, I guess, relatively safe to rely on that you're not really willing and able I guess, position to not pay them, or at least to use that as the starting point. So if there is some work they could, and even if it's not just a matter of capacity, but capability that they could do, then we're really into that territory where you should be looking at engaging with them, trying to ideally reach agreement, and if not, then I guess forming a view and going with it. But it will be a matter of capability rather than just capacity, how much work there is.
Yes. Thank you, Alastair. One for you, Jessie. What does an employer do if an employee approaches them and says that they've got someone in their bubble who is over 70 and high risk, but doesn't live in their household? Is that an employee who is entitled to essential workers leave?
No, I think the entitlement in terms of essential workers subsidy is quite clear that it is a person who is within their household that is high risk. So I think you'd be asking some questions of the person as to why it is that they need to care for that person, or why it is that somehow they have come into their bubble, whereas perhaps they weren't previously, because it should have just been people within their household. If it is someone who at level 4 they had care requirements for, perhaps somebody where they were, an elderly parent who was living on their own, then it may be that you would agree that it does apply in those circumstances. But I think it would be a case of drilling down into those circumstances. And if it is just a decision that they have made to extend their bubble at that point, then I think that it wouldn't necessarily be an entitlement to that leave.
Well, thank you, Jessie. We've got time for one further question, and I might throw this one to you, Alastair. If an employer owns a cafe and can open an alert level 3, providing takeaway and contactless coffee, for example, what can the employer do if they've only got work for 2 out of their 4 staff due to that reduced ability to work?
Yeah, I think in this scenario, we're in that category where the employer is able to operate to some degree. So all those employees are, assuming they're prepared to work, are going to be in that ready, willing and able category. So we're talking about all employees who are at that point entitled to full pay, at least what's provided for in their employment agreement. If you only have enough work for some, but not all of your staff, as this scenario would, then it's going to be a matter of going out and engaging with staff, ideally saying, look, we only have enough work for 2 people, and then this is what we're proposing to do, and seeking their views on it. And that could be a rotating shift system. So it could be a matter of alternating days. It could be that 2 staff, if they're prepared to remain away on leave and don't actually want to come back, that might fix the issue. But really, you're going to need to get staff buy-in. If you have scope in your employment agreements to select who works and to roster accordingly, then it maybe you can rely on that, and that might give you greater flexibility. But assuming you don't, and it's a matter of all staff are entitled to, let's just say, a guaranteed amount of hours, then you're going to need to reach agreement with them, or ideally propose and consult how the arrangements will work going forward.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for attending today. We hope that's been helpful. The recording will be available to download later today. One thing I am conscious of is that there's no one size fits all, and many of you will have challenges specific to your business moving from alert level 4 to alert level 3. So please do reach out if you've got some questions that that we haven't covered today. Otherwise, look forward to hearing from the Prime Minister at 4 o'clock today with further indications around this. But thank you.